The sun had barely risen over the bustling streets of Boston when Mrs. Rose Thompson prepared for her weekly visit to Brighton Regional Bank. At 78 years old, she stuck to her routines like clockwork. Every Monday at 9:30 a.m., she would visit the bank to check on her modest savings account and deposit her pension check. That particular Monday morning started just like any other. Rose put on her favorite floral dress, the one her late husband had gifted her on their 40th wedding anniversary. The dress was a bit worn at the edges now, but it still brought her comfort. She topped it with her old beige cardigan, carefully fastening each button with her weathered fingers. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, just as she'd worn it during her 35 years as an elementary school teacher. The bus ride to the wealthy side of town was longer than usual that day. Rose sat quietly, watching the neighborhoods change through the window, from her humble community to the pristine streets lined with luxury cars and manicured lawns. The Brighton Regional Bank stood tall and imposing, its glass and steel structure gleaming in the morning light. As Rose stepped off the bus, she held her small purse close, containing her banking documents and the pension check she needed to deposit. Her sensible shoes clicked softly against the polished sidewalk as she approached the bank's grand entrance. The security guard barely glanced at her as she pushed through the heavy glass doors, entering the cool, marble-floored lobby. Inside, the bank was already buzzing with activity. Men in expensive suits and women in designer clothes moved briskly through the space, their heels clicking importantly against the floor. The air smelled of coffee and leather, and the soft murmur of business talk filled the room. Rose took her place in line, standing patiently behind a young businessman who was too absorbed in his phone to notice her. She used the time in line to observe her surroundings, something she'd done countless times before. The tellers behind their polished counters wore crisp uniforms and practiced smiles. The walls were adorned with large photographs of happy families and successful professionals, none of whom looked like her. Classical music played softly through hidden speakers, creating an atmosphere of sophistication and exclusivity. Rose clutched her pension check tighter as the line moved forward. Despite having banked here for over 40 years, she never quite felt at home in this branch. Still, this was where her husband had opened their first account together, and she'd stayed loyal to it even after his passing. The memories of coming here with him, planning their future together, made this place special to her, even if things had changed over the years. As she watched the clock tick toward 10 a.m., Rose couldn't have known that this ordinary Monday morning was about to become anything but ordinary. She couldn't have guessed that her simple bank visit would spark a chain of events that would shake the very foundation of Brighton Regional Bank. All she knew was that she needed to deposit her check and maybe ask about the new fees that had appeared on her last statement. The businessman in front of her finished his transaction and strode away, his leather shoes squeaking slightly on the polished floor. Rose stepped forward, her heart beating a little faster as she always did when it was her turn. She'd been coming here for decades, yet somehow the grand atmosphere still made her nervous. She took a deep breath, straightened her back as best she could, and walked up to the teller's window, completely unaware that she was about to become the center of a story that would change everything. The morning light streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Rose smiled warmly as she approached the counter, ready to greet the teller just as she had done hundreds of times before. Little did she know, this simple moment would become the beginning of a day that would expose the hidden prejudices lurking beneath the bank's polished surface and ultimately lead to a revolution in how the entire institution treated its customers. In her hand, she held not just a pension check, but unknowingly the key to a powerful lesson about judgment, respect, and the dangers of making assumptions based on appearances. The events that were about to unfold would not only change her life, but would send ripples through the entire banking community of Boston. The moment Rose reached the teller's window, she could feel something was different. The young woman behind the counter, Miss Parker, barely looked up from her computer screen. Her perfectly manicured nails continued clicking against the keyboard as if Rose wasn't even there. After what felt like an eternity, she finally raised her eyes, giving Rose a quick once-over that made her feel smaller than she felt in years. "Can I help you?" Miss Parker's voice was cold, carrying none of the warmth that Rose remembered from her previous visits. The question wasn't really a question, it was more like a suggestion that Rose might be in the wrong place. Rose pulled out her pension check and bank statement with slightly trembling hands. "Yes, dear. I'd like to deposit this check, and I have a question about some new fees on my account." She pushed the papers forward with a gentle smile, the same smile she used to reassure nervous first graders during her teaching days. Ms. Parker picked up the check with 2 fingers as if it might be contaminated. Her eyes narrowed as she glanced at the amount. "This is the premium banking section," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "For our high-value clients. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of our community branches." The words hit Rose like a physical blow. She'd been banking here since before this young woman was even born. "But I've been a customer here for over 40 years, Rose explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "My husband and I opened our account here in 1982. A few other customers in line started shifting uncomfortably, some pretending not to notice what was happening, others watching with barely concealed interest. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. That's when Mr. Henderson, the branch manager, approached. He was a tall man with graying temples and an expensive suit that probably cost more than Rose's monthly pension. He didn't smile as he came to stand beside Ms. Parker's window. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, though his tone suggested he'd already decided what the problem was. "This lady is insisting on being served here," Ms. Parker explained, emphasizing the word lady in a way that made it sound like anything but a term of respect. Mr. Henderson turned to Rose, his expression a masterclass in polite dismissal. "Ma'am, as my colleague mentioned, this branch primarily serves our premium clients. We have several other locations that might be more suitable for your banking needs." He paused, then added with false concern, "There's a lovely community branch just 3 bus stops away." Rose felt her chest tighten. In all her years, she'd never been treated this way at the bank. She reached into her purse with dignity, pulling out her long-time customer card. "I understand what you're saying, but I've been banking here since before this building was even renovated. Perhaps we could check my account." Instead of taking her card, Mr. Henderson gestured to a security guard who had materialized nearby. "I don't think that will be necessary. We reserve the right to refuse service, and I believe it would be best if you visited one of our other locations." His voice was firm, leaving no room for discussion. The security guard stepped closer, his presence alone making Rose's heart race. Other customers were now openly staring, some looking embarrassed, others simply turning away. A young woman in line seemed about to speak up, but then thought better of it. "Please," Rose said, her voice barely above a whisper, "my husband and I built our life savings in this bank. We trusted you with everything we had." Tears were beginning to well in her eyes, but she blinked them back, determined to maintain her dignity. Mr. Henderson remained unmoved. "Ma'am, if you don't leave voluntarily, we'll have no choice but to escort you out. We have a certain standard to maintain here." The security guard took another step forward. Rose's hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from a mixture of hurt and indignation. As she gathered her things, she noticed her reflection in the polished marble wall, an elderly woman in a worn floral dress being treated like an intruder in a place she'd trusted for decades. With as much grace as she could muster, Rose turned toward the door. The security guard followed close behind, making sure she left. As she reached for her phone, her fingers trembled slightly, but her voice would be steady when she made the call that would change everything. What the bank staff didn't realize was that their actions that morning would have consequences far beyond anything they could imagine. The bright morning sun hit Rose's face as she stepped outside, and she had to squint against its glare. Standing there on the sidewalk, clutching her pension check and her dignity, she took a deep breath. Then, with movements that betrayed none of the turmoil she felt inside, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. Standing on the bustling sidewalk outside Brighton Regional Bank, Rose felt a mix of emotions she hadn't experienced in years. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her phone, not from age, but from the hurt and humiliation still fresh in her mind. The morning sun felt too bright now, almost harsh, as if highlighting her moment of distress for all to see. As she dialed her son's number, a few tears finally escaped, rolling down her cheeks. She quickly wiped them away with the sleeve of her cardigan. A businessman walked past, briefly glancing at her before looking away uncomfortably. Rose had never felt more visible and invisible at the same time. "Hello, sweetheart," she said when her son answered, trying to keep her voice steady. But mothers can never really hide their pain from their children, and her son immediately noticed something was wrong. "Mom, what's happening? Are you okay?" His voice carried the concern and authority that had made him so successful in the business world. Rose could hear papers shuffling in the background. He was probably in the middle of something important. "I'm sorry to bother you at work," she began, her voice catching slightly. "But something happened at the bank. They asked me to leave." The words felt bitter in her mouth. She hadn't wanted to call him, hadn't wanted to burden him with this, but she needed someone to know what had happened. There was a sudden silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a carefully controlled voice, her son asked, "Which branch are you at, Mom?" She could hear him standing up, chair scraping against the floor. "The main branch on Wellington Street," she replied, watching as more customers walked past her into the bank, each of them received with welcoming smiles by the same staff who had just ejected her. "The one where Dad and I opened our first account." "Stay right there," he said, his tone carrying a weight she rarely heard. "I'm coming." Before she could protest, telling him not to interrupt his busy day, he added, "And Mom, I love you." Rose found a bench nearby, her legs feeling suddenly weak. As she sat there, clutching her purse and unused deposit slip, she thought about all the years she'd spent in this bank. She remembered bringing her son here when he was just a little boy, teaching him about saving money. How he would stand on tiptoe to see over the counter, proudly depositing his piggy bank savings. The same counter where, minutes ago, she had been treated like an unwelcome intruder. An elderly couple walked past, heading into the bank. They were dressed similarly to Rose, but their skin was a different color. They were greeted warmly, ushered inside with smiles and courtesy. Rose felt a fresh wave of pain wash over her as she watched this scene unfold. Time seemed to move strangely as she waited. The bustling city life continued around her, cars honking, people rushing to meetings, vendors selling hot dogs from their carts. Everything was normal, yet nothing felt normal anymore. She watched as pigeons pecked at crumbs near her feet, remembering how she used to share her lunch with them during her teaching days. A young mother struggled past with a stroller, and Rose automatically stood up to help her navigate the curb. Even in her distress, the teacher in her couldn't ignore someone who needed assistance. The mother thanked her with a genuine smile, the first real smile Rose had received all morning. As she sat back down, she noticed her reflection in a store window across the street. She saw what the bank staff had seen: an elderly woman in a worn floral dress and old cardigan. But they hadn't seen what was beneath: the woman who had educated hundreds of children, who had saved carefully with her husband for decades, who had raised a son to believe in justice and hard work. The minutes ticked by slowly. Rose watched as more people entered and left the bank, each transaction a reminder of how differently she had been treated. She thought about calling her best friend to tell her what happened, but decided against it. Some hurts were too fresh to share right away. A street musician started playing somewhere nearby, the gentle notes of his saxophone floating through the air. Rose closed her eyes for a moment, letting the music wash over her. Her husband had loved jazz, and the familiar sounds brought both comfort and a tinge of sadness. Then she heard it, the distinctive sound of expensive tires rolling to a stop on the street in front of her. Rose opened her eyes to see a sleek black car pull up to the curb. Even before the door opened, she knew her son had arrived. What she didn't expect was the small group of distinguished-looking people who emerged from other cars right behind his. As she watched them approach, Rose felt a sudden shift in the air, like the moment before a summer storm breaks. She didn't know it yet, but this moment, this simple act of a son responding to his mother's distress, was about to unleash a change that would ripple through the entire banking institution. The morning's humiliation was about to transform into something much bigger than herself. The sleek black car's door opened, and Rose's son stepped out, his presence commanding immediate attention. At 45, Thomas Thompson had the kind of confidence that came not just from success, but from knowing exactly who he was and what he stood for. He adjusted his perfectly tailored suit as he walked toward his mother, his face a mixture of concern and barely contained anger. Behind him, a group of board members emerged from their vehicles, 5 distinguished individuals in business attire, each carrying leather portfolios and wearing expressions that meant serious business. The small crowd of pedestrians on the sidewalk instinctively parted to let them pass. "Mom," Thomas said softly, reaching Rose's bench. He bent down to hug her, not caring that his expensive suit might wrinkle. The familiar scent of his aftershave, the same brand his father used to wear, brought fresh tears to Rose's eyes. "You didn't have to come," she whispered, but they both knew that wasn't true. Thomas helped her stand, keeping one hand protectively on her elbow. "Mrs. Thompson," one of the board members said, stepping forward, "we deeply apologize for any distress you've experienced today." The woman's voice was sincere, her face showing genuine concern. She'd known about Thomas's humble beginnings, they all had, but seeing his mother in person, visibly shaken, made the morning's events even more shocking. Thomas turned to face the bank's entrance, his jaw set firmly. "Shall we?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. The group moved toward the doors, with Thomas and Rose in the lead. The security guard who had escorted Rose out earlier now rushed to open the door, his face paling as he recognized her. Inside, the bank fell eerily quiet. The classical music continued to play softly in the background, but all conversations stopped as the group entered. Mr. Henderson, the branch manager who had been so dismissive earlier, was at his desk. Through the glass walls of his office, they could see him looking up, his expression changing from curiosity to confusion to dawning horror. Ms. Parker, the teller who had treated Rose so poorly, was still at her window. She froze mid-transaction as she watched them approach, her perfectly manicured fingers hovering over her keyboard. Other employees began to whisper among themselves, sensing that something momentous was about to happen. Thomas led the group straight to the center of the lobby. His voice, when he spoke, carried clearly through the hushed space. "I'm Thomas Thompson, CEO of Wilson Financial Holdings and the new owner of Brighton Regional Bank." The whispers stopped completely. You could have heard a pin drop. Mr. Henderson practically ran from his office, his face now a shade paler than his white shirt. "Mr. Thompson, sir. We had no idea you were visiting today. It's such an honor to—" "Stop," Thomas said quietly, but with enough authority to make the manager step back. "This morning, you've humiliated my mother. The same woman who worked 2 jobs to put me through college. The same woman who has been a loyal customer of this bank for over 40 years. The board members spread out slightly, their presence creating an unofficial courtroom in the middle of the banking floor. Other customers had stopped their transactions to watch, sensing they were witnessing something significant. My mother," Thomas continued, his voice carrying years of hard work and determination, "taught me that character matters more than appearances. That treating people with dignity should be as natural as breathing." He turned to face the other customers in the bank. How many others have been judged by their clothes instead of their character in this branch? Mr. Henderson started to stammer an excuse, but Thomas held up his hand. "When I acquired this bank 3 months ago, I deliberately kept a low profile. I wanted to see how our branches truly operated, how they treated real people, not just those in expensive suits." Rose stood quietly beside her son, her head held high. She thought about all the times she'd taught her students about respect and dignity. Now her son, who had sat in her classroom as a boy, was teaching that same lesson in his own way. Thomas nodded to one of the board members, who opened his portfolio and began taking notes. "This isn't just about my mother," he announced. "This is about every person who has walked through these doors and been judged by their appearance rather than their character. Today marks the beginning of a change." The silence in the bank was deafening. Miss Parker had sunk into her chair, her earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked a lot like shame. Mr. Henderson stood frozen, probably seeing his career crumbling before his eyes. Rose reached out and touched her son's arm gently. In that moment, she wasn't thinking about the humiliation she'd endured or the satisfaction of this revelation. She was remembering the little boy who used to count his pennies at this very bank, who had grown into a man determined to right wrongs and make a difference. Thomas covered her hand with his own, then turned back to address the stunned audience. The next words he spoke would set in motion a series of changes that would transform not just this branch, but the entire banking institution. The morning's painful incident was about to become a catalyst for something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. The next hour in Brighton Regional Bank unfolded like a scene from a movie. Thomas led his mother, the board members, and the thoroughly chastened bank management into the largest conference room. The space, with its polished mahogany table and leather chairs, had hosted countless important meetings, but none quite like this one. "Please, everyone, take a seat," Thomas said, helping his mother into the chair at his right hand, a position of honor that sent a clear message to everyone present. The bank's security cameras had been recording all morning, and now a young IT specialist was setting up the footage on the large screen at the end of the room. Mr. Henderson shifted uncomfortably in his chair as the morning's events played out in high definition. The footage was damning, showing every dismissive gesture, every contemptuous look, every moment of discrimination in crystal clear detail. Rose watched quietly, her hands folded in her lap, as her own humiliation was displayed for all to see. "Stop the video," Thomas commanded when they reached the part where his mother was escorted out. The frozen image of Rose standing alone on the sidewalk spoke volumes. He turned to the board members who had been taking notes throughout the viewing. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas began, his voice controlled but carrying an edge of steel, "what we've just witnessed isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a deeper problem." He pulled out a folder from his briefcase and laid it on the table. "Over the past 3 months, our mystery shoppers have documented similar incidents across multiple branches." The board members exchanged concerned glances. One of them, a woman with silver hair not unlike Rose's, spoke up. "This is deeply troubling, Mr. Thompson. Your acquisition of the bank was meant to modernize our operations, but clearly we need to address more fundamental issues." Rose listened as they discussed statistics and patterns, her teacher's mind automatically organizing the information. She thought about her former students, how she taught them that everyone deserved respect, regardless of their appearance or background. Now, in this elegant conference room, those same lessons were being taught again. "Mom," Thomas said suddenly, turning to Rose, "would you share with everyone what it felt like? They need to hear it from you." His voice was gentle, understanding how difficult this might be for her. Rose straightened in her chair, smoothing her worn floral dress with dignity. "When I first started banking here," she began, her voice soft but clear, "my husband and I had just gotten married. The tellers knew our names. They asked about our dreams, our plans. When Thomas was born, they gave us a silver baby cup that we still have." She paused, looking around the table. "Today, for the first time in 40 years, I felt ashamed walking through those doors. Not because of who I am, but because of how I was seen, or rather, how I wasn't seen at all." The room was silent. Even Mr. Henderson, who had been staring at his hands, looked up, his face showing the first real signs of understanding. "The thing is," Rose continued, warming to her subject like she used to in her classroom, "banking isn't just about money. It's about trust. It's about believing that the person across the counter sees you as a human being, not just a transaction or an inconvenience." Thomas reached over and squeezed his mother's hand, pride evident in his expression. He then turned to address the room again. "Starting today, we're implementing comprehensive changes. Not just sensitivity training or diversity workshops, though those will happen, but a complete overhaul of how we view and treat every customer who walks through our doors." The board members were nodding now, their pens moving rapidly across their notepads. The senior board member, a gentleman who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Mr. Thompson, would your mother be willing to serve on our newly formed Community Advisory Board? Her perspective would be invaluable." Rose looked surprised, but Thomas smiled. "That's an excellent suggestion, but the decision is hers to make." He turned to his mother, raising an eyebrow in question. Before Rose could answer, the door opened and a young assistant hurried in. "Sir, there's something you should see," she said, handing Thomas a tablet. He glanced at it, then passed it around the table. Someone had posted about the morning's events on social media, and the story was spreading rapidly. "Well," Thomas said, standing up, "it seems the court of public opinion is already in session. Let's make sure our response shows not just what we plan to do, but who we truly are as an institution." He looked at his mother, who was still processing the invitation to join the advisory board. "After all, isn't that what you always taught me, Mom? Actions speak louder than words." Rose smiled, remembering countless times she'd said those exact words to her students. She never imagined they would echo in a bank's conference room, changing policies and touching lives. As she looked around at the faces turned expectantly toward her, she realized that perhaps her teaching days weren't quite over after all. In the days that followed, Brighton Regional Bank underwent a transformation that no one could have predicted. Thomas wasted no time in implementing changes that would reshape the bank's entire culture. The Grand Lobby, which had once felt so intimidating, was about to become a very different place. The first change came early Monday morning, exactly 1 week after the incident. Mr. Henderson's office was empty, his personal items packed away in a cardboard box. He had been given the option to resign or undergo extensive retraining. He chose resignation. Ms. Parker, the teller, had chosen a different path. She'd written a heartfelt apology letter and asked to be part of the change, starting with entry-level training all over again. Rose sat in her living room, sipping tea from her favorite cup as she watched the morning news cover the story. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since the incident went viral. Old students, former colleagues, and complete strangers reached out to share similar experiences. Each story strengthened her resolve to help make things right. Breaking news: Major bank announces revolutionary changes after discrimination incident, the headline read. The reporter stood outside the bank's main branch, where workers were installing a new sign. In an unprecedented move, Brighton Regional Bank's new CEO has announced sweeping reforms following last week's viral incident involving discrimination against an elderly customer who turned out to be the CEO's mother. The camera cut to Thomas at a press conference, standing tall at the podium. "Banking is about more than money," he said, echoing his mother's words from the conference room. "It's about trust, respect, and human dignity. Starting today, every single employee, from our executive board to our newest teller, will undergo comprehensive training in inclusive banking practices." But the changes went far beyond just training. The bank's physical space was being redesigned to be more welcoming. The intimidating marble counters were being replaced with open spaces and comfortable seating areas. The sterile artwork was coming down, to be replaced by photographs celebrating the community's diverse history, including one of Rose and her late husband opening their first account. In the break room, which had once been a place for gossip and complaints, employees now gathered for daily discussions about customer experiences. The security guard who had escorted Rose out was now leading sessions on respectful conflict resolution, drawing from his 20 years of experience to teach others what he wished he'd done differently that day. Rose's dining room table had become command central for the new Community Advisory Board. Twice a week, she hosted meetings with people from all walks of life: small business owners, retirees, students, and local community leaders. They shared their banking experiences, both good and bad, helping to shape policies that would serve everyone fairly. Mrs. Thompson, a young teller trainee, had asked during one of the advisory sessions, "How do we make sure we never make assumptions about people based on how they look?" Rose smiled, remembering all her years in the classroom. "You look at each person as if they might be someone's mother, someone's father, someone's child, because that's exactly who they are." The bank's transformation caught the attention of the entire financial industry. Other banks started calling, wanting to know more about the Thompson method of inclusive banking. Thomas received invitations to speak at conferences, but he always insisted on bringing his mother along. Together, they shared their story, not just the incident, but the lessons learned and the changes made. 1 month after the incident, Rose walked into the bank again. This time, there was no hesitation in her step, no nervousness about how she'd be treated. The new sliding doors opened smoothly, and she was greeted by name. The lobby buzzed with a different kind of energy now, warm, welcoming, alive with genuine human connection. She noticed a young woman in a worn jacket, clutching papers nervously, much like Rose herself had done that fateful day. But this time, a teller was already walking over, offering a warm smile and assistance. Rose watched as the woman's shoulders relaxed, her anxiety visibly melting away. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson," called several voices as she made her way to the customer service area. She wasn't just Rose the customer anymore. She was Mrs. Thompson, the heart and soul of the bank's transformation, the teacher who had turned a moment of humiliation into a movement for change. As she settled into one of the new comfortable chairs, Rose pulled out her pension check, the same one she'd tried to deposit that day. But now it represented something more than just money. It represented the power of standing up for what's right, the importance of treating everyone with dignity, and the unexpected ways that life could turn a wrong into a right. The morning sun streamed through the new floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm glow over the transformed space. In that light, Rose could see her husband's wisdom in staying loyal to this bank all those years ago. Sometimes, she thought, you have to go through the darkness to help create the light. 6 months after that life-changing Monday morning, Brighton Regional Bank had become a model for financial institutions across the country. The final piece of the transformation was about to fall into place on a bright autumn morning as Rose prepared for a very special ceremony. She stood in front of her mirror, adjusting a new dress she'd bought for the occasion. This time, it wasn't a worn floral print, but an elegant blue outfit that her son had insisted on getting for her. "You're the guest of honor, Mom," Thomas had said. "It's time to let yourself shine." The bank's main lobby had been transformed into an event space. Where cold marble counters once stood, there were now rows of chairs filled with employees, community members, and representatives from banks across the country. The press had gathered too, their cameras ready to capture what many were calling a revolutionary moment in banking history. Rose sat in the front row, watching as Thomas took the podium. Behind him hung a large banner that read, "Community First Banking Initiative, a new era of inclusive finance." She couldn't help but think about how far they'd come from that painful morning 6 months ago. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas began, his voice carrying clearly through the space, "today marks not just a new chapter for Brighton Regional Bank, but a turning point in how we think about banking itself." He gestured to the diverse crowd before him. "Look around this room. Every person here has a story, a dream, a reason for walking through these doors. And every single one of those stories matters." The audience nodded in agreement. Among them sat Ms. Parker, the former teller who had chosen to change. She had recently been promoted to head the bank's new customer experience department, using her own transformation to help others understand the importance of treating everyone with dignity. "In the past 6 months," Thomas continued, "we've served over 50,000 customers across our branches. But more importantly, we've listened to their stories, we've learned from their experiences, and we've built something new together." He turned to smile at his mother. "And it all started because one brave woman refused to let injustice go unchallenged." Rose felt tears welling up in her eyes as Thomas unveiled the bank's new mission statement, permanently etched in glass near the entrance. "Every person who walks through these doors carries a lifetime of stories. How privileged is to become part of their story and to help write its next chapter." The ceremony continued with the official launch of several new programs: a financial literacy initiative for schools, a senior banking assistance program, and a community investment fund. But the moment that touched Rose most deeply came when a group of her former students, now grown with children of their own, stepped forward to share how her lessons about respect and dignity had shaped their lives. "Mrs. Thompson didn't just teach us math and reading," one of them said, his voice thick with emotion. "She taught us to see the worth in every person. And now, thanks to her and her son, that lesson will touch countless lives through this bank." As the ceremony drew to a close, Thomas invited Rose to cut the ribbon for the bank's new Community Welcome Center, a space specifically designed to make banking accessible and comfortable for everyone. Her hands were steady as she held the scissors, just as they had been steady all those years holding chalk in her classroom. The crowd erupted in applause as the ribbon fell, but Rose was looking beyond them, to the regular customers already lined up for the day's business. There was a young mother with a baby, an elderly gentleman with his retirement papers, a teenager with his first paycheck, all waiting to be served with the respect and dignity they deserved. Later that afternoon, Rose sat in what had become her regular spot in the customer lounge area. She watched as people came and went, each one greeted by name, each one treated like they mattered. A small girl waved to her from her mother's arms, and Rose waved back, remembering all the little ones she'd taught over the years. "Would you like some tea, Mrs. Thompson?" asked one of the new customer service representatives, carrying a tray with Rose's favorite blend. The bank had started offering complimentary beverages to all customers, another small touch that made the space feel more like a community center than a cold financial institution. As she sipped her tea, Rose thought about how sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of courage. She thought about her husband, who had always believed in standing up for what was right. She thought about her son, who had turned a moment of injustice into an opportunity for transformation. But mostly, she thought about all the people who would walk through these doors in the years to come, people with dreams, with worries, with hopes for the future. Thanks to one difficult morning and the changes it sparked, they would all find something here that went beyond mere banking. They would find respect, dignity, and the recognition that every person's story matters. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the bank's new windows. Rose gathered her things, ready to head home. As she stood, she caught her reflection in the glass, not just an elderly woman in a blue dress, but a teacher who had never stopped teaching, a mother who had never stopped nurturing, and a spark that had ignited a flame of change that would burn bright for years to come.